Ned had been a great fusser, to whom every page of prose gave a certain pain, which he politely tried to conceal, or to explain with maximum politeness, his hands showing a tremor as they shuffled sheets of manuscript, his handsome face pale with the strain of a hangover or of language's inexhaustible imperfection. His voice had had that hurried briskness of 30s actors, of Ronald Colman and George Brent, and meticulously he had rotated his gray, brown, and blue suits, saving a double-breasted charcoal pinstripe for evening wear. A tiny gold rod had pressed the knot of his necktie out and the points of his shirt collar down. He wore rings on both hands and had never married. Bech wondered now if he had been a homosexual. Somehow not marrying in those years could seem a simple inadvertence, the omission of a dedicated man. "Piss off, you bitch," he used to blurt out from beneath his pencil-lined mustache when one of the poodles did its duty. And it took years for Bech to realize that Ned did not mean the dog, but the woman with taut nylon ankles who was overseeing the little sparkling event. Yet Ned had been especially pained by Bech's fondness for the earthier American idioms, and they spent more than one morning awkwardly bartering tits, as it were, for tats, the editor's sharpened pencil silently pointing after a while at words he took no relish in pronouncing. Dear, dead Ned. Bech sensed at the time he had his secret sorrows, his unpublished effusions and his unvented appetites, but the young author was set upon his own ambitions and used the other man as coolly as he used the mailman. Now the man was gone, taking his decent, double-breasted era with him. Through the great bowed pane of Mr. Flaherty's office, the vista of the East River and of Queens' waterfront industrial sheds was being slowly squeezed away by rising new construction. Flaherty also was tall, 6'3" at least, and the hand he extended was all red-knuckled bones. He wore blue jeans and an open-necked shirt of the checkered sort that Bech associated with steelworkers out on their bowling night. He wondered, how does this man take his authors to restaurants? "It's super, Doreen is letting me handle you," Flaherty said. "I've been told I'm hard to handle." "Not the way I hear it. The old-timers I talk to say you're a pussycat." This young man had an uncanny, dreamy smile and seemed content to sit forever at his glass desk, smiling, tipped back into his chair so that his knees were thrust up to the height of his stacked in and out baskets. His lengthy, pale face was assembled all of knobs, melted together. His highbrow especially had a bumpy shine. His desktop looked empty, and there was no telling what he was thinking as he gazed so cherishingly at Bech. Bech asked him, "Have you read the book?" "Every fucking word," Flaherty said, as if this was unusual practice. "And?" "It knocked me out, a real page-turner, funny and gory." "You have any suggestions?" Flaherty's wispy eyebrows pushed high into his forehead, multiplying the bumps. "No, why would I?" "The language didn't strike you as a bit rough in spots?" One of Ned Clavell's favorite phrases. This idea seemed doubly startling. "No, of course not. For me, it all worked. It went with the action." "The scene with Olive and the video crew?" "Gorgeous, raunchy as hell, of course, but with, a lot of crazy tenderness underneath. That's the kind of thing you do so well, Mr. Bech. Mind if I call you Henry?" "Not at all. Sock it to me, Jim." Bech still had not got what he wanted, an unambiguous indication that this fellow had pondered the manuscript. He had the strange sensation, talking to Flaherty, that his editor had not so much read the book as inhaled it, that Bech's book had been melted down and evaporated in these slice-of-pie-shaped offices and sent into the ozone to join the former contents of aerosol cans. Here, in Vellum's curved and pastel halls, languidly drifting young women in vampira makeup outnumbered any signs of literary industry. The bulletin boards were monopolized by tampon and lingerie ads torn out of magazines, with all their chauvinistic implications underlined and annotated in indignant slashing felt tip. Flaherty's walls were white and mostly blank, but for a grainy blow-up of Thomas Wolfe about to board a trolley car. Otherwise, they might be sitting in a computer lab. Bech asked him, "How do you like the title?" Easy Money? So he had got that far. Not bad. Might confuse people a little with all these how to get rich in the coming crash books on the market. The original title was Think Big, but I'd found it hard to work under. I couldn't get going, really, until my wife told me to scrap the title. Think Big, huh? Flaherty's eyes, deep in their sockets of bone, widened. I like it. They were beryl, an acute pale cat color. Don't you? I do, Bech admitted. It comes at you a little harder somehow, more zap, more subliminal leverage. Bech nodded. This tall fellow, for all his languor and rural costume, talked Bech's language. They were in business. Bech is back was to be the key of the advertising campaign. Newspaper ads, 30-second radio spots, cardboard cutouts in the bookstores, posters showing Bech as of over a decade ago and Bech now. 15 years in the making was a subsidiary slogan. But first, 9 months of gestation had to be endured while proofs languished in the detention cells of book production and jacket designs wormed toward a minimum of bad taste. Back in Ossining, Bea was frantic over the loss of Anne's virginity. If only it had been Judy, she explained. She wouldn't be so shocked. But Anne had always been the good one, the A student, the heir to Rodney's seriousness. Maybe that's why, Bech offered. It takes some seriousness to lose your virginity. Always flirting and hanging out with the cheerleaders like Judy, you get too savvy and the guys never lay a glove on you. Oh, what do you know? You've never had daughters. I had a sister, he said, hurt. I had a 21-year-old mistress once. I bet you did, Bea said. Typical. You're just the kind of thing Rodney and I hoped would never happen to our girls. The twins were 17. They would be 18 on Valentine's Day. The deflowerer, if Judy could be believed, was one of the speckled crowd crunching around in the driveway with their father's cars. I don't see it's any big deal, Bech said. I mean, it's a peer, it's puppy love, it's not rape or Charles Manson or anybody. Didn't I just read in a survey somewhere that the average American girl has had intercourse by around 16 and a half? That's with everybody figured in, Bea snapped. The ghettos, Appalachia, and all of that. If I'd wanted my girls to be ghetto statistics, I would have moved to a ghetto. Listen, Bech said, hurt again. Some of my best ancestors grew up in a ghetto. Don't you understand? Bea asked, her face white, her lips thinned. It's a defilement. A woman can never get it back. What would she do with it if she got it back? Come on, sweetie, you're making too fucking much of this. Easy for you to say. Easy for you to say anything, evidently. Do you think this would have happened if that book of yours hadn't been in a house? All that crazy penthouse sex you cooked up out of your own sordid little flings? I didn't know Anne had read it. She didn't have to. She heard us talking about it. It was in the air. Oh, please, it doesn't take a book of mine to put sex in the air. No, of course not. Don't blame books for anything. They just sit there behind their author's grins. You act as though the world is one thing and art is another, and God forbid they should ever meet. Well, my daughter's virginity has been sacrificed, as I see it, to that damn dirty book of yours. Bech had never seen Bea like this before, raging. What frightened him most were her eyes, unseeing, and the mouth that went on, a machine of medium soft flesh that could not be shut off. This face that had nested in every fork of his body floated like some careening gull in the wind of her fury, staring red-rimmed at him as if to swoop at the exposed meat of his own face. Jesus, he offered with mild exasperation, this kid is 17. Let her fuck if that's what she wants. It's not what she wants. How could she want one of those awful boys? She doesn't want it. That's the point. What she wants is to show me, her mother, for leaving her father and screwing you. I thought it was Rodney who left. Oh, don't be so literal. You know how these things are. It takes two. But then my taking up with you so quickly, really, in that house on the vineyard that time, and the way we've been here, so happy with each other. Her face was going from white to pink and drifting closer to his. I never thought of how it must look to them, the children, especially the girls. Don't you see, I've made them face what they shouldn't have had to face so early, their own mothers. Now her face was on his shoulder, her breath hot on his neck. Sexuality, and of course, they hate it. Of course, they want to do self-destructive things out of spite. He was in her grip, no less tight for her being grief-stricken, as her storm of remorse worked its way through B's fragile, Christian nervous system. Tough, Semitic Bech, dreamer and doer both, author of the upcoming long-awaited Think Big, pondered, open-eyed, the knobbed and varnished and lightly charred mantle of their fieldstone fireplace. Above it, there was an oil painting with a china blue single-clouded sky of a clipper ship that B's maternal great-grandfather had once captained, depicted under full sail and cleaving a bottle-green sea as neatly crimped by waves as an old lady's perm. Upon it, 2 phallic clay candlesticks, one by Anne and one by Judy, executed by the twins in some vanished summer's art camp at Briarcliff, and now, by consecrated usage, set on either end of the mantelpiece. Beside it, a fishing rod with broken reel that Donald had chosen to lean forever in the corner, where the fieldstones met the floral wallpapered wall. Bourgeois life, its hooks came in all sizes. He patted B's back and said, "And for all this, you blame me?" "Not you. Us." Like Adam and Eve, the first great romantic image, the expulsion. The aboriginal trinity of producer, advertiser, and consumer. This woman's fair head was full of warping myths. Her sobbing had become its own delicious end, a debauchery of sorts, committed not with him, but with Rodney's ghost, to the accompaniment of spiritual stride piano, played by that honorary member of many a Jew-excluding organization, Judge R. Austin Latchett. Bech looked around for cold water and threw some. "What about birth control?" he asked. B looked up out of her tear-mottled face. "What about it? If the kid's humping, she better have it, or you really have something to cry about." B blinked. Maybe it was only one time. Bech flattened a tear at the side of her nose, tenderness returning. "I'm afraid it's not something you do only once. You get hooked. Have you ever talked to the girls about all this?" "I suppose so," B said vaguely. "I know at school they took hygiene." "It's hard, Henry. For a long time they're so young it wouldn't make any sense, and then suddenly they're so old you assume they must know it all, and you'd feel foolish." "Well, there are worse things than feeling foolish." It was hard for him, on his side, to believe that this woman needed his advice, his wisdom, the music of female mockery, and of its southern cousin female adulation, had played in his ears for 5 decades. So it was hard for him to hear this shy, wifely tune, this gentle, halting request for guidance in a world little more transparent in its fundamental puzzles to female intuition than to male. "You must talk to her," Bech advised firmly. "But how can I let her know I know anything without betraying Judy?" The prototypical maze, Bech remembered reading somewhere, was the female insides. He tried to be patient. "You don't have to let her know. Just tell her as an item of general interest. Then I should be talking to them both at the same time." She had a point there, he admitted to himself. Aloud he said, "No, in this area being a twin doesn't count anymore. You can imply to Anne you've had or will have the same conference with Judy, but for now you want to talk privately with her. Listen, the girl must know she's gotten in deep. She wants to hear from her mother. She's not going to grill you about what you know or how you know." The more persuasively he talked, the more slack and dismayed her expression grew. "But what do I say exactly to start it off?" "Say, Anne, you're reaching an age now when many girls in our society enter into sexual relations. I can't tell you I approve because I don't. But there are certain medical options you should be aware of. It doesn't sound like me. She'll laugh. Let her. She's a little girl inside a woman's body. She's suddenly been given the power to make a new human life out of her own flesh. It's more frightening than getting a driver's license. She's more frightened than you are." "How do you know so much?" "I'm a man of the world. People in my profession." A new thought struck B. "Don't boys like that use things?" "Well, they used to, but in this day and age, I expect they're too spoiled and lazy. They don't like that snappy feeling. But if I begin to talk contraception with her so calmly, it amounts to permission. I'm saying it's fine." Panic squeezed this last word out thin as a wire. "Well, maybe it is fine," he said. "Think of Samoa, of Zanzibar. Western bourgeois civilization, don't forget, is a momentary aberration in the history of Homo sapiens. She heard the impatience of his tone, his boredom with wedded worry and wisdom. Henry, I'm sorry I'm being stupid. It's just I'm so scared of doing the wrong thing. For some reason, I can't think. Well, he began in a deep voice for the third time, it's easy to give advice where it's not your own life and death. On the matter of my book, you were very hard-headed. And you resent it, she pointed out, dry-eyed at last. After this fraught discussion of sexuality, it seemed to Bech, be pulled back, she who had once been so giving and playful, so honestly charmed to find this new, hairier, older, more gnarled and experienced man in her bed. Now, when at night, finished reading, he turned off his light and experimentally caressed her. She stiffened at his touch, for it interrupted her inner churning. Even under him and enclosing him, she felt absent. "What are you thinking about?" he would ask. It would be as if he had startled her awake, though the whites of her eyes gleamed sleeplessly in the oceaning moonlight. Sometimes she would confess, blaming herself for both the girl's sin and this its frigid penance. "Anne, can't you give it a rest? God in heaven, I wish I could." At Vellum, lanky, laconic Flaherty had a young female assistant, a quick, black-haired girl fresh from Sarah Lawrence, and Bech wondered if it was her hands that showed in the Xeroxes the firm sent him of his galley sheets. Whoever it was had held each sheet flat on the face of the photocopier, and in the shadowy margins, clear ghosts of female fingers showed. Some so vivid, a police department could have analyzed the fingerprints. Bech inspected these parts of disembodied hands with interest. They seemed smaller slightly than real hands. But then womanly smallness, capable of Belgian embroidery and Romanian gymnastics, is one of the ways by which the grosser sex is captivated. He looked through the photocopied fingers for the hard little ghost of a wedding or engagement ring and found none. But then she might have been employing only her right hand. At last, Bea did take Anne aside on an evening when Judy was working late on the senior yearbook, and they had their conversation. "It was just as you predicted," Bea told Bech in their bed. "She wasn't angry that I seemed to know. She seemed relieved. She cried in my arms, but she wouldn't promise to stop doing it. She isn't sure she loves the boy, but he's awfully sweet. We agreed I'd make an appointment with Dr. Landis to get her fitted for a diaphragm." "Well then," he said, "after all that fuss—" "I'm sorry," Bea apologized. "I know I've been distracted lately. You want to make love now?" "In principle," Bech said, "but in practice, I'm beat. Donald made me bowl 6 strings with him over at Pin Paradise, and my whole shoulder aches. Also, I thought I'd take the train into town tomorrow." "Oh?" "There are some things I want to go over on the galleys with Flaherty. It's better if we can hash it out right there, and I want to be sharp. He's deceptive, all lazy and purring, and next thing is at your throat. I thought you said he never had any suggestions, unlike that other editor you had years ago." "Well, he didn't, but now he's developing some. I think he was babying me before, since I'm a living legend." "Okay, dear, if you say so. Love you." "Love you," Bech echoed, preparing to fold his mind into a dark shape, a paper airplane to be launched with a flick from the crumbling cliff of consciousness. But Bea broke into his dissolution with the thought, spoken aloud toward the ceiling, "I worry now about what Judy will say. Somehow I don't think she'll approve. She'll think I've been too soft." His sweet suburban softy, Bech thought sibilantly, and slept. At his suggestion next day, Flaherty introduced him to his assistant. "Arlene Schoenberg," Flaherty said, stooping in his shin of mattress ticking, like some giant referee overseeing a jump-off between 2 opposing players at a midget basketball game. The girl was small, slender, and sleek, with hair in a Lady Dracula fall, a chin 1 centimeter longer than strictly necessary, and sable eyes fairly dancing in their web of sticky lashes with delight at meeting Henry Bech. "Mr. Bech, I've admired you for so long." "I feel like old hat," Bech finished for her. "Oh, no," the girl said aghast. "So you tote bales for Mr. Jim here," Bech said. "Arlene has all the moves," Flaherty said, shuffling about to blow the whistle. Bech had held on a half-second longer than necessary to her hand, her dear, small, busy, clever hand. It was much whiter than in the Xeroxes, and decidedly pulsing in his. He glided back to Ossining as the early winter dusk enwrapped the signal lights, the grudged wattage of the station platform, the vulnerable gold of the windows of homes burning in the distance, all softened by the tentative wet beginnings of a snowfall. His head and loins were light with possibility, merely for Flaherty had taken him to lunch at a health food restaurant where no liquor was served, and when they had returned, Arlene Schoenberg was absent on a crosstown errand. Bech drove his old Ford, only 33,000 miles and 18 years of ownership, home through the cosmic flutter. He was met by a wild wife. Bea pulled him into the downstairs bathroom so she could impart her terrible new news. Now Judy wants one, too. One what? Bea's eyes, after his brooding upon Arlene's dark, heavily lashed ones all through the lulling train ride, looked so bald and blue. Bech had to force himself to feel there was a soul behind this doll's stare. One diaphragm, Bea answered, putting the lid hard on her desire to scream. I asked her if she was making love to anybody, and she said no. And I told her they couldn't fit one in with her hymen intact, and she said she broke hers horseback riding years ago, and I just have no idea if she's lying or not. She was awfully cocky, Henry. I know now I did the wrong thing with Anne. I know it. Bea uttered all this in a choked, tearful rush. He had to hug her, there in the downstairs bathroom, the smallest room in the big house. You did the right thing, he had to say, for she had followed his advice. But why did Anne have to run right away and tell her? Bea asked, betrayed. Bragging, Bech offered, already bored. He felt this woman's mind narrowing in like the vortex in a draining bathtub toward an obsession with her daughter's vaginas. There must be more to life than this. He asked Bea, what would Rodney have done in this situation? It was the wrong name to invoke. This situation wouldn't have happened if Rodney was still here, Bea said, making little fists and resting them on Bech's chest in lieu of thumping him. Really? He asked, wondering whether this could be so. Rodney had gone from being a pill and a heel to become in absentia, the very principle of order, the clockwork god of the deists, hastily banished by the Romantic Rebellion. Could he really have stopped the girls from growing up? Bea's face was contorted and clouded by a rich pink veil of mourning for Rodney. Beyond a certain age, women are not enhanced by tears. Bech shrugged off her absent-minded grip upon him and snapped, Here's a simple solution. Tell Judy she has to go out and get fucked first before you'll buy her a diaphragm. Get a diaphragm the old-fashioned way, ran through his mind. Earn it. He left her weeping in the tiny room with its honorable, solid, turn-of-the-century plumbing and surveyed the weather from the bay windows. It was snowing hard now, thick as a ticker-tape parade. The mass of woods behind the house was toned down almost out of sight, and in the near foreground the spherical aluminum bird feeders suspended from the old grape arbor swung softly back and forth like a bell buoy in a whispering white sea. Donald was outside, trying to toboggan already on the fresh fallen inch, and the twin girls were huddled, giggling, on the long orange sofa in the TV den, which had been intended 100 years ago as a library. On its shelves, Bech's books still waited to be integrated with the books already there. Rodney had been a history buff and collected books on sailing. The girls' faces looked feverish with secrets. Their giggles stopped when Bech loomed in the doorway. Why don't you two little angels, he asked them, stop giving your mother a hard time with your nasty little cunts? Fuck you, Uncle Henry, Judy managed to get out, though their 4 gray eyes stared in fright. Rather than wax more ogreish, he climbed the stairs to his silver room and read proof for the hour before dinner. Downstairs, a trio of female voices was lifted in pained chorus, chanting the scandal of Bech's brief exchange with the twins. The front door slammed as Donald came in, frozen, his voice loud with complaint at the toboggan's performance. Happiness was up here as the tendrils of emendation thickened along the margins, and the electric heaters glazed Bech's shins with warmth. Blizzards are ideal for doing proof, he thought. Socked in, Bird at the South Pole, Raleigh in the tower. The storm felt sexy, but beneath the goose-down puff, Bea whimpered to him, I'm sorry, sweetie. This thing with the girls has exhausted me. Judy and Ann and I had a big cry about everything, but it still all feels so up in the air. Wind softly whirred in the chimney of their bedroom fireplace with its broken damper. Gently his hand sought to tug up the flannel of her nightie. "Oh, Henry, I just can't," Bea pleaded. "After all this upset, I just feel dirty down there." When her breathing slowed to a sleeper's regularity, and the house sighed in all its walls as the storm cuffed its frame with rhythmic, airy blows, Bech, in his meteorological rapture, masturbated, picturing instead of his own thick hand that small, dark, dirty, Xeroxed one. The snow descended for 48 hours, and they were snowbound for another 2 days. The pack of pimply wolves attracted to this house by Anne and Judy's pheromones assembled now not in their father's cars, but on cross-country skis, and in one especially well-equipped case on a Kawasaki snowmobile. The boys, puffed up by parkers to the size of that cheerful monster made out of Michelin tires, clumped in and out of the front hall, tracking snow and exhaling steam. Bea's immediate neighbors, too, tracked in and out, swapping canned goods and tales of frozen pipes and defrosted food lockers. The oral tradition in America was not quite dead, it seemed, as sagas of marooned cars, collapsed gazebos, and instant Alps beside the plowed parking lots downtown tumbled in. The worst privation in Ossining appeared to be the few days' non-delivery of the New York Times. Withdrawal symptoms raged at breakfast tables and beset stolid bankers as they heaved at the snow in their driveways, recklessly aware of bubbles of ignorance in their bloodstreams that might reach their hearts. All day long, while feathers whipped from the spines of drifts and children dug tunnels and golden retrievers bounded up and down in the fluff like dolphins, people in hushed tones discussed the scandal of it, of being without the Times. Television stations flashed pictures of the front page to reassure outlying districts that it was still being published, and the Citizen Register, serving Ossining, Briarcliff, Croton, Buchanan, Cortland, expanded its World Nation section, but these measures only underlined the sense of dire emergency, of being cut off from all that was real. Bech retreated from the timesless hubbub to his silver-lined room, adding tendrils to his proofs like a toothpicked avocado pit sending down roots into a water glass. For the first time, he began to think he might really have something here. Maybe he really was back. The gestation period of 9 months dictated that Think Big be a summer book. And that helped it. It didn't have to slug it out with that muscle-bound autumnal crowd of definitive biographies or multi-generational novels with stark titles like Lust or Delaware and acknowledgement pages full of research assistants, nor with their hefty spring sisters, the female romancers and the feminist decriers of the private life. Think Big, in its shiny aqua jacket, joined the popsicles and roller coasters, baseball games and beach picnics as one of that summer's larky things. "It melts in your mouth and leaves sand between your toes," wrote the reviewer for the East Hampton Star. "The squalid book we all deserve," said Alfred Kazin in the New York Times Book Review. "A beguilingly festive disaster," decreed John Leonard in the Daily Times. "Not quite as vieux chapeau as I had every reason to fear," allowed Gore Vidal in the New York Review of Books. "Yet another occasion for rejoicing that one was born a woman," proclaimed Ellen Willis in the Village Voice. "An occasion for guarded wonder," boomed Benjamin DeMott in Partisan Review. "That puts us in grateful mind of Emerson's admonition, books are the best of things well used, abused among the worst." An occasion, proposed George Steiner in the New Yorker, to marvel once again that not since the Periclean Greeks has there been a configuration of intellectual aptitude, spiritual breadth, and radical intuitional venturesomeness to rival that effulgence of middle-class Middle European Jewry between, say, Sigmund Freud's first tentative experiments with hypnosis and Isaac Babel's tragic vanishing within Stalin's Siberian charnel houses. People, simply opined, A blast if you skip the scenery, and featured Bech and Bee repairing their grape arbor in his and hers carpenter coveralls. Even before the sparkling notices came rolling in, the fair weather flags had been up. Bech was photographed by Jill Kremens, caricatured by David Levine, and interviewed by Michiko Kakutani. The Book of the Month Club made Think Big its alternate choice for July, with a special warning to squeamish subscribers. Bantam and Pocket Books engaged in a furious bidding of which the outcome was a well-publicized figure with more zeros than a hand has fingers. Bech is in. Vogue splashed in a diagonal banner across a picture of him modeling a corduroy coat and a ribbed wool turtleneck. Bech surprises was Time's laconic admission in a belated follow-up piece, they having ignored Think Big during publication week in favor of a roundup of diet cookbooks. What surprised Bech, that remarkably fair summer, was seeing his book being read at beaches and swimming pools by lightly toasted teenagers and deep-fried matrons, and even by a few of his male fellow commuters during his increasingly frequent trips to New York. Having taken Donald swimming one day at the pool of Bee and Rodney's old club, Bech saw a bronze and zaftig young woman on a plastic strap chaise holding the book up against the sun, reading it through her rhinestone-studded sunglasses. "How's it going?" he asked aloud, feeling guilty at the pain he must be giving her, the squint, the ache in her upholding arm. She lowered the book and stared at him, dazed and annoyed. It was as if he had awakened her. He saw from the tightening of her zinc-white lips that she made no connection between the world she had been immersed in and this stocky, woolly male intruder in outmoded plaid trunks, and that if he did not instantly move away, she would call for the lifeguard. Yet she had an appealing figure and must have an emptiness within, which his book was in some sense filling. He was his own rival. He came to flinch at the sight of his aqua jackets. They were as vivid to his sensitized sight as swimming pools seen from an airplane. He had filled the world with little distorting mirrors. Think Big was in its 6th printing by September, and Big Billy telegraphed in congratulation from Hawaii, "Grow old along with me. The best is yet to come." He couldn't even take Arlene Schoenberg to lunch in an unprestigious Italian restaurant without some nitwit asking him to sign a scrap of paper. Usually one of those invitations to a health club staffing topless masseuses that are handed out all over sordid Midtown. Every time an autograph seeker approached, it put more stardust in Arlene's eyes and set seduction at another remove. The world, by one of those economic balancings whereby it steers, had at the same time given him success and taken from him the writer's chief asset, his privacy. Her little fascinating hands enticingly fiddled with her knife and fork, caressed her Campari and soda, and dropped to her lap. After a moment, like an actress taking a curtain call, one of them returned into sight to scratch with a fingernail at an invisible itch on the side of her slightly long chin. She asked him where he got his ideas, from real life or out of his imagination. She asked him if he thought a writer owed anything to society or just to himself. She asked him if he had always been such a neat typist and good speller. Now, her little brothers and sisters, none of them could spell. It was really shocking. You wonder if there will be any books at all in 20 years, the terrible way it's going. Bech told her that credit for his typing and spelling should go to May, a dark genius his wife had found for him in Ossining. In an attempt to steer Miss Schoenberg's fascination away from his professional self, he talked a good deal about his wife. He gave B credit for finally settling him down in front of a typewriter and getting him to finish his book. He further confessed, putting the intimacy level up a notch, that when he had married her, he had not realized what a worrier she was. She had seemed, in contrast to her difficult sister, Norma, so calm and understanding, so, well, motherly. And indeed, she had proved motherly. She thought about her kids all the time and nearly went wild when one of her daughters began to... Bech hesitated, for this starstruck minx was also somebody's daughter, and the word fuck or screw, running ahead as a kind of scout, might startle her into a defensive posture. "Misbehave," he said. As he spoke, the house in Ossining, with its dome-shaped lawn and coarse green exoskeleton and cool silver-lined retreat, became uncomfortably real. The storm windows were only half up. Some insulation needed to be taped and restapled in his study. Bech wondered if the magic appeal of those Xeroxed hands haunting the edges of his duplicated galleys might not have been a mirage peculiar to that cloistered environment. Certainly, Miss Schoenberg, as she sat perkily across from him in her sparrow-colored sweater, gave signs of being common. "It must be terribly exciting to be a writer's wife," she said. "I mean, she must never know what you're thinking." "Oh, I expect she knows as much as she wants to. I mean, when you look at her, she must feel she's being X-rayed. You write about women so well, she must feel naked." Campari and soda always gave Bech the same sensation as swallowing aspirin, that burny feeling at the top of the esophagus. Thinking of naked, he stared glumly at Arlene's thready sweater and found it utterly opaque. Did she have breasts in there, or typewriter spools? She was wearing a thin gold chain which nobody had ripped off her neck yet, and she was going on. "Writers have such rich fantasy lives. I think that's what makes them so fascinating to women." "Richer, you think, than, say, Mr. Flaherty's fantasy life?" It was an inspired stab. She said petulantly, "Oh, him. All he fantasizes about is the Mets and then the Jets. Really. And where to get good Mexican brown like they used to groove on at college, when he was picketing the ROTC and marching with Dylan and all that. You seem," Bech ventured, "to know him pretty well." For the first time, her eyes lost their starry celebrity shine and submitted to an amused and sexual narrowing. "Well enough. He's a good boss. I've had worse." Bech nostalgically wished he were back home raking the lawn. But Arlene Schoenberg was just getting relaxed, her shapely hands deftly twirling green fettuccine onto a fork. The restaurant skills of New York women, like praying mantises roving the twigs of a creosote bush. He should have had more Gothamesque eating out in his book, and the way the tables are moving out into the streets, into the soot. His silence brought a slow smile to Arlene's face, showing a provocative rim of gum. "See," she said, "I have no idea what you're thinking." "I was wondering," he told her, "if there was a way we could get Vellum to pay for this lunch. Can you forge Flaherty's signature, or aren't you that friendly yet?" Her eyes became solemn, bright circles again. "Oh, no." "Okay, then. On me. What else can I do for you?" "Well," she absent-mindedly, tuggingly, fiddled up a loop into her gold chain and squeezed her finger in it so that the tip turned bright red. "That brother I was telling you about, you know, did want me to ask you if you could possibly come talk to his 7th grade class. It's a special school for dyslexics out toward Glen Cove. They'd be so, you know." Bech saw his opportunity and took it. He patted her bare hand as it lay distracted on the check tablecloth. "I'd like to," he told her, "but I can't. The last time I spoke in a school, I got involved in a disastrous affair with a woman who only cared about the literary me. She spurned the man. Wasn't that rotten of her?" "I'd have to know the circumstances," Arlene Schoenberg prudently said, as if there had never been a sexual revolution, and pulled back her hand to cope further with the fettuccine. On the walk from the restaurant back to the Vellum offices, they passed the Doubleday window, which held a pyramid of think bigs. Bech always pitied his books, seen in a bookstore. They looked so outnumbered. He had sent them forth to fight in inadequate armor with guns that jammed. These unbought copies were beginning to fade and warp in the daily slant of sun. On the train home, he saw how many of the yellowing trees were already bare. Soon it would be a year since he had finished the book Bea had got him to sit down and write. Their household had changed. The girls were off at college, Anne at MIT and Judy at Duke, and little Donald no longer wanted his stepdad to take him places. Each fall, they used to go to one Ossining High School football game together, played by mostly black players on a field where you could smell the torn earth and hear each cheerleader's piping voice fragile against the sky. This year the boy, newly 13, had looked disdainful and begged off. His father's snobbery was welling up through his genes. Rodney had taken Donald instead to the Harvard-Princeton game at Palmer Stadium. The house crackled in its timbers and joints now that the furnace was on again and a heat differential applied torque. Workmen were busy inside the house and out, since Bech's book had made $1 million. The north face of the mansard roof was being given new slates, and the grand front staircase was being fully refinished after 10 years of a half-scraped left-hand banister. The television crew of 60 Minutes had come and rearranged all the furniture, exposing how shabby it was. Within the many rooms, Bech had been somewhat avoiding Bea. She wanted mostly to talk about their household expenditures, or to complain that Donald kept climbing on the roofer's scaffolding after they had gone for the day. "He has these horrible new delinquent friends, Henry. With Anne and Judy off, I thought we'd be so relaxed now." "How did that ever work out, by the way, with the diaphragms?" She looked blank. If there was one thing Bech resented about women, it was the way they so rapidly forgave themselves for the hysteria they inflicted on others. He prompted, "You remember Judy wanted one too, but she was still a virgin?" "Oh yes, didn't I tell you? It was very simple. I don't know why we didn't think of it. Dr. Landis fitted Anne for one and then gave me a prescription for two the same size. After all, they are twins." "Brilliant!" Bech sighed. "Sweetie, could you spare a minute and look at these Sloane's catalogs with me? What I'd like to do around the fireplace is get sort of a conversation pit feeling without having it look like a ski lodge. Do you think boxy modern looks silly on a big Oriental?" The hinges of his jaw ached with a suppressed yawn. "I think," he said, "the room looks nice enough now." "You're not focusing. The staircase being all new and shiny shows everything else up. If it's the cost you're worried about, Sheila Warburton says with things so unsettled in the Middle East, any Oriental you buy is a better investment than stocks, than gold." "I love those old wing chairs," Bech said. In the evenings he would sit in one, his feet up on an inverted bushel basket that was meant to hold wood, and read. He was reading Thomas Mann on Goethe, Wagner, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Freud these nights. What chums they all turned out to have been. Those chairs were Rodney's mother's, and he really should have them back now that he has a bigger apartment. "Bea, you know we don't have the $1 million yet. It's just a bunch of bits in Vellum's computer. I won't get my first royalties till next August." "That was another thing Sheila Warburton said. You were crazy not to ask for a whopping advance with inflation the way it is." "Damn Sheila Warburton, and that pompous Paul as well. Nobody knew the book would take off like this. In the old days, a respectable author never asked for an advance that was strictly for the no-talent starving down in the village." Standing contemplative in her room of imagined furniture, Bea was hard to rattle. She slowly woke to his tone of indignation and came and embraced him. She had been raking leaves in an unraveling ski sweater that smelled muskily of leaf mold and lank autumn grass. "But these aren't the old days, Henry," she said, tickling his ear with her breath. "It costs a fortune to live down in the village now, and you aren't the old Henry either." She shuddered in happiness, and in her spasm gave him a squeeze. "We're all so proud of you." If there was another thing Bech resented about women, it was the way they enveloped, the way they yearned at moments of their convenience to dissolve the sanitary partition between I and thou. Assimilation, the most insidious form of conquest. He was becoming a shred of leaf mold. "I don't know about that book," he began. "The book is wonderful," she interrupted with breathy impatience. "When do we do another?" Another? The thought sickened him. A whole new set of names to invent, a theme to nurture within like a tumor, a texture to maintain page after page. His suburban softy, his plot of earth, was insatiable. "Sure," Bea said, briskly backing off. "The storm windows are up. You've done all the publicity the media can stand. You've said the same thing to 20 different interviewers. What are you going to do with your days?" "Well, there have been some invitations to read at colleges. Some little agricultural college in West Virginia sounded interesting, and an Indian school in South Dakota." "Oh, you've done all that," Bee said. "You don't need to expose yourself for peanuts anymore or fuck those little co-eds in the Ramada Inn. Don't think I don't know really why you did all that speaking." Her sideways glance was both hostile and flirtatious, a common marital combination. And he resented female knowingness, its coy invasion, its installation of an Oberführer in every province of his person, his mind, body, mouth, genitals. B had possessed them all and set up checkpoints along every escape route. His triumph, to quote Vogue again, was more deeply hers than his. That night in bed, when she insisted on copulating, it was, he felt, with the body of her own triumphant wifeliness that she came to climax, cooing above him, and then breaking into that ascending series of little yips that had the effect, on this occasion at least, of swallowing up his own climax as something relatively trivial. More and more, B favored the female superior position. As the air in the bedroom seasonally cooled, she kept on her nightie, becoming in the dark a tent of chiffon and lace and loose blonde hair, an operatic apparition whose damp grip upon him was swaddled and unseen as she pulled him up forcefully into manhood, into achievement, into riches and renewed fame, into viscid fireworks and neural release. She collapsed onto his chest, panting, "I feel so satisfied with you," she confided. "And I with you," he responded, trusting the formal grammar to shade his inevitable and, as it were, pre-shaped rejoinder. She heard the shadow. "Aren't you pleased?" she asked, "not only about the book, but about us? Tell me." "Yes, I'm pleased, of course."